I prefer that you address the panel as a whole, speaking of which I will allow them to introduce themselves, starting on my right.
Hi, I'm Paula. I used to work for
Great. So we can go through our teams and you can tell me your speaking order and preferred pronouns if you have any, starting with opening government.
So John is speaking first, Neil speaking second, myself.
Opening opposition.
Kristen speaking first, begin.
One second, stay down.
Closing government.
me, Alex, Gina.
Closing opposition.
Why do you first there?
Alright. I wonder if I was explaining to you.
Yeah, I can stuff the table. It doesn't fit.
No, that's not the same table. Cool. Alright. Time for you. You can get one clap at 1, 1 at 6, 2 at 7, and 3 at 15. Are there any questions before we begin? No? Given that then, we welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate. Go ahead.
I need a camera to see the shot. We believe that in resource-rich, underdeveloped countries, it is necessary and imperative to let these companies come and extract our mines. That leads to great economic development, but also political leverage over these countries. We believe that the story that these companies are bad, doing bad things, is just a made-up story by the opposition to rally up voters, like in Serbia, and all of these things. But necessarily, we believe that this will be done in a good way. The second, we can extract some concessions. Thirdly, that this is necessary for economic development, and fourthly, that this leads to political concessions. So, on to the first thing. Why will this be done in a good way? First, there is internal pressure inside these countries. For instance, in Serbia, there was huge protest because of this, and people care about their environment and all these things. We should ensure that certain checks and balances were implemented by the government. Why is this so? Firstly, people care about their environment really much, especially in the current context of climate change, but also this is the most proximate thing for them. They see their lakes, they see the trees, they know the air pollution is affected on their daily lives. So people care about the environment very much, so they care and they will protest and implement certain checks and balances to the local government, meaning that the local government has an incentive to create certain regulation that stops all of these companies, Western companies, from actually doing bad things. But the second reason here is that these are Western companies, not necessarily Chinese, meaning that Western companies also have external pressure to act in a good manner for two reasons. Firstly, a lot of these companies are controlled to an extent by EU countries. EU has a green deal that they want to meet their zero net carbon or whatever emissions and all of these things, but also people also care about the energy, environment and all these things. They are controlled, that they are also have inside checks and balances, the clarification on, okay, that's 5 minutes and all of these things. But secondly, these companies have a reputation to maintain, meaning that even if they act in a horrible way, other countries will not let them in because other people can see what they have done, meaning that they have an incentive to actually create waste management, to not steal the land of all of these people and do it in a good manner. So what does this create? What are the regulations that are implemented? First, there are a lot of waste management. So this waste that is created is not just dumped in the air and in the lakes, but creates certain system that can refine it and create it more sustainable. And secondly, we believe that if your land is, taken, you will receive huge compensation. In Serbia, 200,000 euros are received for taking a small house where they want to create the mine and all of these things, but thirdly, such as workers' rights and all of these things. They have the ability already, they earn infinite money, it's infinite money which I'll explain it later, but necessarily what now they have an incentive to also do. So how are these, second part, how are these deals created? First, we believe that oftentimes these countries take a part of the profit, that is part of the deal, meaning the profit that these companies make are actually distributed to these countries for their stuff like this. But secondly, you can gain a lot of upstart money at the beginning, a lot of euros, millions of euros, maybe even more at the beginning, until you receive privileged deals to buy the end product at a maybe discounted price, or just these minerals or whatever at a better price, and all of these things, but generally it's just a concept for you and all of these things. Yes, clarification.
Yeah, so the way that these deals work is you pay a license fee on how much you'll be able to get as a revenue off of it. All the profits and everything else go to the main company. That's their incentive for respond and get
we explained how this looks. It's what you said, but it's also what we said and all of these things. I don't know what you want to tell me now. First time, why is this good for the economy of these countries? First reason, you develop parts of the country that are greatly underdeveloped. Usually it's the rural areas that are not big cities, don't have that much infrastructure, don't have that much jobs and all of these things. These areas are underdeveloped because they generally have less political capital. You have a lot less people here. These people are not generally high-skilled workers, less educated, and all of these things. So you just necessarily push them away and focus on the big cities and all of these things. But also just economically more viable for you to develop bigger cities and all of these things. What changes now? First, we directly open new factories that are able to employ people here and earn them a higher wage. But secondly, other jobs are also, how you say, implied. Transport, refining, other service sectors, and all of these things. So creates trickle-down effect on other jobs. But really, we develop other infrastructure, such as roads, so that the trucks can travel faster, certain highways so we can connect these areas and all of these things. Right? So this is beneficial to these parts of the country where they have no alternative, where they don't have a job, and they don't have a good wage. Now they have a job which is high pay, good paying, and all of these things which is better than the alternative. Second reason why this is better for the economy is we have more investment in these countries overall. What investments are we talking about? We're talking about investments that are dependent on these green minerals. Companies that refine, companies that actually create batteries from them, companies that use these batteries to create other machineries, all of these things. These companies will now move to these countries because it's much cheaper for them to move there than to pay transport, to transfer to another continent and all of these things. It's easier for them to position here. This creates another trickle-down effect. We gain more companies which are also high-skilled and can position themselves abroad across the entire country, which is a good thing overall. Finally, on economics, is the state has more money for two reasons. Obviously, they can tax them much more, but second, they get upfront money and the profit and all these things. This is very important, and this money is huge for two reasons. These minerals are very scarce in the world. You don't have them that often and all of the things. But secondly, the demand for these minerals is huge, especially when we want to develop green technology, especially when we want to develop all these things. So the demand is always huge, but the resources are scarce, meaning that the price is much worse. This money can be used for pension funds, healthcare, infrastructure, and all of these things, which we really believe that if the state has more money, it will at least, even if it's corrupt to an extent, some of the money will be used in good terms, even if it's government handouts. We believe this is a good thing and a lower impact on our side of the house. Why is this necessary? And why no other investments will come? Firstly, we have diminishing of returns on the other side of the house, meaning that a lot of investments already happen, a lot of things have developed. But secondly, there is a crisis, economic crisis in the rest of the Western world. They have recession, inflation, they don't want to invest much, and thirdly, on political point, the politics are much more closed than all of these things. Second argument, why we have more leverage over the West, these countries. Firstly, notice these countries are dependent greatly on the West. From investments, they also get traders and stuff like this. But now we have leverage over them. Because the thing that they are very want to have, very dependent on this scarce mineral that they need to use to create green energy, which are their political talking points, we have. Meaning we have a leverage over them. What does that mean? Firstly, we can extract a lot of things. When we just accept this, we can get more money from them, we can get better trade deals, we can have loans with less interest rates and all of these things. But secondly, we have leverage over them later down the line. We can use this to, let's say, pass certain policies. For Serbia, it's more in EU integration. Serbia is begging us, all of Scholz is on his knees, begging us to let Lithium here and all these things. We have leverage over them, we can use them to actually get other deals which are necessary and important for these countries. Not only is this necessary for the economic development of these countries that are not very rich, but we also get leverage over the EU and other countries, both opening up.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I now welcome the leader of the opposition to begin the opening of case.
And something important to notice about these countries, and really all countries around the world, is that there is already a massive pivot to moving up on the value chain and to start processes in manufacturing. Why is this so? Because this is a sector where these countries are likely to be massively competitive. Because their local labor is still relatively cheap, but their input cost at a point where they have abundant resources is relatively low. This is for two reasons. Because one, they don't incur things like transport costs and buying in the international market, and secondly, at a point where supply locally is relatively high, then there is a base amount of intuition to say that this drives the price of these raw materials down. This means that these nations are already to a path of growing their manufacturing sector. The counterfactual that we propose here is relatively simple. We propose that this mining should be done by either local companies or, in some cases, for example, state-owned enterprises, wherever these countries term that this would be necessary. The second piece of framing that is important in this debate is that this deal is likely to be put together in a very specific way. For one, the West is interested in taking these resources and selling them to the richest possible clients in the world market, which turns out that in a lot of cases with lithium, is countries like China that already have a strong manufacturing sector, i.e. a lot of demand for this product. Secondly, the profits that these companies get are likely to be taken away from their initial source of essentially developing them. That is to say that these companies are likely to take away the money that they make and put these investments toward other branches of their own corporation. For example, in the cases of MNCs where they have multiple enterprises going on in a lot of different countries at the same time. The third thing to say is that we think that these countries have a massive amount of capacity in the status quo to mine a lot of these resources themselves. This is for four reasons. For one, because of the progress of technology, meaning that things like the cost of automation has been significantly decreased, meaning it's a lot more accessible to these companies. Secondly, because they can access things like developmental loans, which often enable these countries to unlock different means of developing their local industries. Thirdly, because we posit that creating an extractive sector is not particularly hard. You don't need, for example, a very, very specifically trained workforce, PhDs, etc. It's a relatively easy thing to train people in. Fourthly, these countries that were mentioned in this slide aren't particularly underdeveloped. Countries like Argentina have well-functioning economies, and we think at a point where they have some level of government investment, they're likely to pop up these industries in a good way. First, that in response to OG on the fact that you get a short-term benefit which allows you to build up social systems, we posit that this simply doesn't work because building up a welfare state or a state that is specifically conducive to human well-being requires a lot of cash and continuous cash supply for two reasons. One, because it's relatively difficult, meaning that there's a lot of trial and error involved. That is to say that if you get a lot of cash at point one, but you make some sort of mistake and that cash is longer, for example, you misplace or misallocate your resources in the healthcare industry, then it would be much better for you if you could have continuous supply of cash in order to amend these trial and errors later than that. Secondly, because these countries are facing a growth of population, meaning the demand for a lot of public services is likely to be greater down the line. So we don't think that this short-term internal investment is going to be sufficient. Two arguments to advance with Homo. One on the value chain, and secondly on this is going to be locally disruptive to environments. First, value chain. We posit that it's significantly better if these countries would simply sell this produce themselves. At a point where you don't have to share profits, this is very beneficial for you because every single dollar or every single amount of money that you make matters to these countries in a massive way for two reasons. OG already recognizes that they have a need to build up their social welfare, which is something that we posit is very important as well. But B, we think that this enables investment into a lot of local industry down the line as well. Consider things like tax revenue, for example, where it's significantly more difficult for you to extract sufficient tax revenue from a multinational corporation than it is from a domestic corporation, meaning that your government is also significantly more likely to be bolstered in its financial means, meaning that you can invest to other sectors within your country that will also potentially be massively profitable. B, the fact that you have these raw materials means that you can use them to make a lot of goods. This is pretty good, but it's only possible at a point where your input costs are relatively low. Because all of these countries, although they're economically developed, for example, Argentina, have some level of instability. So a lot of investors are quite fearful into putting their money into them. At a point where input costs specifically are low though, because they have access to these raw materials, and notice, presumably things like demand for electric vehicles and products of manufacturing that you can make from these materials is going to be high, then this is going to be the tipping point with which investors are going to opt in. This means that these countries can move up in the value chain and make products that they can sell for more, because every single human hour invested into making an electric vehicle brings significantly more profit to these countries rather than simply having extractive industries. Notice they can also specialize to a much greater extent. You're not competing with every single other country that's also offering this resource, but rather you're, for example, specializing in producing a specific type of green technology, meaning to also have significantly more likely to have a productive economy and critically a comparative advantage compared to a lot of other states. C, you get a lot of good auxiliary benefits. At a point where you you have a mining sector and a manufacturing sector in your country at the same time, and they have colliding interests, and they're both interested in functioning within the same productive economy, then these are likely to synergize to a great extent. They're likely to create things like local contracts. They're likely to build infrastructure that supplies them to a massive extent, which means you have a development of local manufacturing, which also means that you get higher paying jobs, because generally jobs in manufacturing simply make significantly more profits for the reasons explained before, meaning that you're likely to also lift significantly more people out of poverty. Closing.
The thing that this type of lithium is incredibly important for is electric vehicles and batteries that also have the power. If everything that you're saying is true, and this is the best way, and they want to get into manufacturing, why are none of these countries manufacturing these things?
Well, Mexico is pivoting massively to manufacturing, but it's also not only about electric vehicles, right? This is about EVs, this is about things like green technology, things like having wind turbines, etc. There are a lot of things that you can do with these minerals. Finally, on the mineral grab, there is at the point where you have some push for local manufacturing, then you need to buy these minerals from somewhere. That means that you end up buying probably from those same firms that were extracting this from your country in the first place. So even if they're discounted, as Gulf side says, you still have an expense as opposed to a profit that you get. Second argument, these are likely to be locally massively destructive, and this answers a lot of OG's case as well. A, legislative power. One, the workers within these foreign companies are likely to be imported because these companies don't have an interest in training local workers. It's easier for them to simply bring them in. Because at a point where these people are not citizens of that country where they're committing environmental crimes, it's significantly more difficult to persecute them. Secondly, there's companies' headquarters are likely to be in the West, which means a legislative barrier because you don't have jurisdiction over a company that doesn't have its headquarters or its legal entity within your borders. B, local firms on the counterfactual are likely to care about the environment to a significantly greater extent. One, the employees are local, they're likely to protest against rapid degradation because this is essentially their homeland, they have an emotional connection. But secondly, these companies don't have the massive PR and legal teams as opposed to Western MNCs, so they can be held accountable to a much greater extent. C, lobby power. Big foreign firms make a lot of money from the other operations as well. They can spend time on lobbying, but secondly, foreign firms have very distant customers. For example, consumers in France don't know how these operations run in countries like Argentina, meaning that there's no consumer pressure on these companies to be environmentally conscious. Notice mining operations can be massively destructive, causing erosion, degradation, and destroying other industries in the process as well. For all those reasons, opposed.
Cool. Thanks, Speaker, very much for the speech, and we now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case. Go ahead.
The premise of the OO is that, oh, they're going to do the same and everything will be fine. They assume that it will be the same amount of dollars that you don't need to share. We disagree completely with that. Why? One, we need an extreme amount of investment that this country often doesn't have. Why? You need, first of all, a lot of the research that needs to be done ahead of, which not all these countries is able to do, and all of this did. Second of all, equipment is extremely expensive. They just say, oh, you have equipment. No, this is usually very specific equipment that was developed by Rio Tinto and all of these companies that does not exist on a free market, or even if it exists, it's really expensive to buy. Thirdly, you need a lot of experts. They say, oh, you don't need someone with PhD, you don't need PhD, but we do need experts. Why? Because it's a very specific field. You don't have specific mining in all parts of the world, and a lot of oftentimes all of those people are employed by big companies, and it's hard to get that kind of things. Fourthly, it is often a very specific mineral. We are talking about lithium, zinc. Lithium in Serbia is in a direct form. This is something very specific. You cannot just go and ask everyone who has mined anything in the world and just say, oh, you mine this. No, this is you need different procedures to extract it, you need different procedures to mining. This makes it so that it's much more easier for these companies to do. Notice that they also have experience doing this in the past. They have already, they know how to do it. It's less likely that they will make mistakes. It makes just the whole process easier and less expensive. So the comparative is that, first of all, a lot of the countries are just afraid to go into this. Because they're afraid to take a risk of doing something. It is extremely unpopular as a leader of a country to fail to do something like this. Often those countries don't have resources to even, borrow that much of the money because they're already borrowing a lot of money for other things to countries to work. It is unable to get that much of money, and this investment is unlikely. The comparative is, firstly, a lot of these countries are not going to get this done at all. And even when they do, because of all of this, less efficiency, you're getting less efficiency of the selling of those things. So when they say, oh, we're keeping the whole profit, yes, but the whole profit is much smaller because of all of these things. Secondly, they say, oh, you're just getting a little bit of money, so I kind of license. Honestly, I have no idea whether it's a profit or a license, but if it's a license, it is pretty plausible that the license you need to pay, regularly on a regular basis. It is a very high license to pay in the first place because they want to incentivize those companies to do it and give them the money and don't do it themselves. Meaning that there is a high burden to do this, especially when those countries have oppositions of people telling, oh, we don't want this to be mined in our places. That is the point at which companies are ready to pay a lot of the money for the governments to overcome that pressure and actually allow them to do. Also, the licenses are likely to be, extended as 5 years to 10 years, meaning that the countries will be able to negotiate new prices if there is a need for that. The conclusion of this is that there will be some, significant amount of money, especially because those countries need it. Not only for electric vehicles, but it is also, for wind turbines, for sun energy. You also need accumulators to actually be able to run, and you need batteries for all those kind of things. Okay. The second thing that the OO says is that it's going to be more polluted on our side of the house because, first of all, people who work there are important, so it's less efficient to prosecute them. First of all, it's efficient to prosecute foreigners. I don't know why it is. Second of all, it's not like one boy is throwing something in the river and then you need to prosecute them. It is that the whole company have completely different way in which they do this, meaning that it's really easy to see and it's really easy to actually do something like this. Second of all, they say that they don't have the jurisdictions. Usually there is a jurisdiction, even if you're not based in a country, if you're doing something bad to that country, almost all countries have jurisdiction to prosecute that. But realistically, this is not going to be settled in a court. What is realistic is we tell you that in a negotiation part of the deal, because there is a huge opposition to this in those countries, in order for those leaders to stay in power and to actually explain this, they're likely to need to get deals that are good and are good. Thirdly, notice that on their side you get a lot of corruption and nepotism. It is on their side of the house that you get people who are less competent, who are more likely to get away with doing bad stuff than on our side of the house. They just say lobby power, yes, but notice that on this particular case, we have a lot of the power to negotiate too, because they don't have anything else to extract. The comparative is that they have to buy it from China, which is the biggest of this. They don't want to cooperate with China because they have bad foreign relations. They have to do, some negotiations. That it is much easier for them to negotiate with us, meaning that they lose a part of that too. But notice also that Georgia gives you comparative analysis where there is a huge pressure on the Western companies to have, good standards of the ecology. On their side of the house, you get the standards of Serbia and Argentina, who are probably quite, verse to begin. Okay. So what is the point and why our case is really important? Before that, any guys? No. Okay. Okay. Why is it extremely important for these countries to be able to negotiate more about this? Notice that when these countries choose to yes.
Oh yeah, is the green transition going to succeed?
I don't know. I don't care. I think it's highly unrealistic that it's completely going to fail. Even if 30% of the energy stays in green things, that is completely fine. Notice that these countries, when they bind to us, it is extremely difficult difficult for them to change to someone else. There is a scarcity of these minerals, and they will have to, now start working with China, meaning that you have a lot of the power at that point because they cannot change down the line 10 years in the future. What does it give you? It gives you the ability to actually make better trade deals with these countries, to actually be able to export more for these countries, to be able to actually have power on an international scene, which is, for example, really important for Serbia because we have dispute, etc. All this is soft power to these countries, which is really important for them because the West is the one who can give a huge of the soft power and has been given to their partners. And at the end of the day, what we really think is most important in this debate is life for those people, is the amount of money that I think conclusively is on our side of the house and everything that we get. So thank you.
Alright, I thank the speaker very much for this speech, and we now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off top half.
Okay. Start speaking. I think there are two very important factors when it comes to mining. The first is which that it's extremely profitable, that means there's a lot of money in it. But the second thing to note is that they spent very intensely environmentally degrading, and that does not manifest only in CO2 emissions, as OG claims that we care about CO2 emissions, but rather in soil erosion, rather in the long-term water supply that you have as a country. And I don't think they have provided a feasible reasoning as to why they're going to get the level of environmental protections under their side of the house. What do you think are the interests of these resource-rich nations? The first is to maximize your value chain to generate value in the short and long term, a critical piece of framework responded to. The second is to protect the environment in the long term, and I'm going to deal with that later. But furthermore, and this is important, it is to reduce foreign influence, and that is to retain the maximum of the sovereignty you have as a nation. I'm going to show you why this leads down the line to worse impacts for these nations than for example, companies like British Petroleum can stay in the country for 50 years and then go on and take more and more resources in other sectors. Why are they likely not to get a good deal from Western corporations? The first one of which is to note that they maximize profits, right? They want to get every dollar, they want to squeeze every penny out of every dollar they do. That means they're going to lobby for reduced environmental protection and regulations, both presently and down the line. The second thing to note is that the prices they pay for licenses are not going to be as high as they would want to in some instances, but there's obviously a problem of characterization, right? Because insofar as opening government claims that, there's a massive demand for them in all instances, I fail to see when there's this amount of high demand, why you shouldn't not going to be able to get money and sell them to these companies that actually need it. Because not all extraction companies are the ones producing it. You still have a majority of companies still making batteries, but do not produce lithium on their own, right? That means they're likely to just give you money in order to, for example, secure supplies down the line from you, right? I think this is matters it. The second thing I want to note is that, for example, in Botswana, that they try to gain a certain percentage of stakeholdership within these foreign companies, like the 24%, but they got denied. The reason for that is that they have so much amount of power and they have lack of power and the lack of regulation to do that. On maximizing the value chain, what did we hear from OG? They said that, you need extreme investment and you need research, right? I think the point is that the research is already done because that's how we know these countries have these resources, so we don't really need to do that. The second thing is that you need tools and machines. I think machine-based mining has existed for centuries. I'm sure there's a good supply of these machines that you can reutilize from other sectors and whatsoever, right? Why can you do this? I think why you can do this is that you can get money from development banks. I think you get money from buyers. I think you get money by simply taking out the loan. They say, you can't take the loan, but insofar as the green revolution is happening and there's such a high demand for it, I fail to see why institutions like the IMF would be unlikely to give them resources for this due to this. Fourthly, I think they have a lot of local capital that exists within these nations. I don't know how rich Serbia is in a lot of instances, but I do think they have some money that they can use down the line. What does this mean? I think this is important because it needs jobs for people that requires skill. And I think down the line that incentivizes governments to fund higher education, for example, because they know they can start up production. It is very hard, for example, in Serbia to say that, we need to increase the amount of higher education, right? But insofar as you can have a productive manufacturing economy and that you need skilled labor that that is educated for it, it is very easy to campaign for that on the comparative. They didn't achieve that on their side of the house. The second thing I want to know, they simply own the means of production. And I think that is extremely valuable for a nation in terms of like just vibe checking that we own this and we have this and we can do whatever we want with this, but simply how people perceive it as well. People in these nations, or more often than not, don't want foreign influence to enter to the scale that they say. Right? And secondly, I just contest the characterization that you don't want local politicians to do this. On to my substantive. I'm not talking about lobby power, I'm not talking about the environment. On the environment, I disregard Lucia's characterization that we care about this. I do agree insofar as that there's a massive amount of discourse happening, for example, on CO2 emissions, right? But note that mining is not only about CO2 emissions, that some resources, that some mining does not emit that much. But what is problematic is, for example, the water supply, soil erosion. These are not things that people generally understand, right? I think most people in the world do not think about the global water supply because we think we have an infinite amount of it. If you do have a lessened amount of water in your country that you can't use, that is a national security threat for you. You're going to be reliant down the line on other nations, on other companies, and when we look at the world that is doing more and more protections, I don't think that is a feasible strategy for you on a national security level. Due to that, I think that it is very likely that you're going to have lessened environmental regulations on this. What does this mean? I think this has massive impact. The first is people are going to die in some instances because you have poisoning. You have, for example, pollution that causes people to die earlier than they should be. I think countries should care about that. The second thing is that you have reduced the control over your food supply, on your water supply. This is a question of security, and we look at companies like Nestle monopolizing water supplies in certain developing economies. I think it's important to consider that it can happen there. All this lobby power can be that these companies say, oh, you need to sell this water to us for a cheaper price because we're already doing this, otherwise our company will be inefficient. Therefore we can pay less salaries for the workers of your country. Right? This is a massive impact to the national security of these nations. On foreign influence, the first thing I want to note is what these companies do is go on public, right? They go on a public street, they put up billboards, they say, they make a picture, for example, of a local person holding a French, I don't know, like, I've seen these campaigns, right, and they say, you're working with us, we are with you, right? I think they do this, but the second thing they do is they influence politicians with two measures. First is lobby power, that is to say they simply fund their campaigns, for example, and this is exclusively under their side of the house, because under their side of the house, these corporations are registered and are active in these nations, which means they can actively lobby, whereas comparatively don't exist under the outside of the house, which means it doesn't happen. But the second thing is they just do a lot of corruption, right? They go to politicians, they give them money, and they influence the decisions that they do. Why do we think this is important? But before that, closing.
To be really clear, the comparative you offer is something that people could do. I'm very unclear as to why the comparative you offer is what people are likely to do.
I'm sorry, I just didn't get that. I didn't understand what point I got that to. But okay, foreign influence, what does this mean? I think they influence certain politicians and voting behavior. Secondly, they fund new politicians and hold them under their control. Why is this extremely important? Because it reduces sovereignty. You have populist candidates, for example, and the important thing to note here is that on principle this is in and of itself wrong because you don't want like foreign companies going in and influencing local politicians. But the second thing is these corporations don't care about social security systems, for example. So in this instance, when they have a politician that will grant them rights to the water supply or will grant them more generous fees or will reduce environmental regulation, they don't care about the democratic will of the citizens within that country. That is on principle and on practicalities bad for them. But further, and this is important, down the line this has a tremendous impact because currently you have X resources that are being used, but down the line in the future new resources will pop up and then you will just campaign and say, oh, but we are already here, you know us, you know our company, we are working with you and you are working for us, let us continue this. This means that these countries will not be able to use the future resources down the line. Why is this exclusive? Because in this instance when these companies are in there, they can meet with these politicians on a day-to-day basis, they can talk to them, they can influence them, they can influence local voting behavior, and we think this is important. Our most unrealistic case is that they don't mind, but I don't understand why that is negative and not in the interest of this country. I do think they should retain sovereignty for those reasons. Opposed.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I now welcome the member of the government to open the back up. I'd like to
complete access no matter who mines the stuff in the first place, because you're just getting forms of money through like then accessing the minerals in the first place. Opening opposition defend a beautiful world where all of these countries go and they make the right decisions for their country and they do the right type of extraction that means you're able to do these things in an excellent way, which leads to economic profit. But I'm obvious why these countries aren't doing it right now and are not likely to do it into the future. I'm going to explain why that is unlikely to happen and what the comparative actually is and why this is something that's incredibly harmful. First, starting from facts, because I think this debate has been lacking them. Firstly, who is the biggest importer of lithium in the world right now? China imports 52% of the world's lithium. They also extract significant lithium within their own country. They need a huge amount of lithium in order to try and capture the green market because they are correct. You use it for electric vehicles, but you also use it for more power holding batteries and all of these sorts of things. It is a very commonly used element that exists within a lot of these things in the first place. Europe, on the comparative, has currently got no form of lithium extraction that exists in a major way across the entirety of Europe, and it needs to get access to a huge number of these minerals in the first place in order to be able to access some of the market that China is currently fulfilling in regards to things like electric vehicles and the majority of green tech. It is essential that Europe has access to this market because it means that it changes the way in which China has dominance over it in the first place. I also think that the contention that we get from this is that a lot of resource-rich countries are trying to move into manufacturing, and this is going to be the way in which they access that market in the first place. The reason this is not true is firstly, they don't have the technical capacity in order to do things such as build electric vehicles, because China already has a huge amount of research dedicated to this in the first place, but also this technology has existed for a significant period of time, and they're not currently doing things such as making electric vehicles, because it's incredibly difficult to do. It takes a huge amount of science, it takes a huge amount of research and development. It's very difficult to make the batteries last a very long time, and all of these things. These countries do not have the capacity to make these things. And note, when countries move into development or into creating things such as technology or producing things within countries, they tend to move into things that people have already been producing for a very long period of time. It's when they produce things that are relatively simple to produce because it means that they are able to use the work that they have and use the capacity that they have in order to make these things. And they do this incredibly cheaply in order to be able to actually sell these things at profit. Because if these countries now start to make electric vehicles, they're only ever going to be able to make incredibly expensive versions of those electric vehicles, and therefore they're never able to sell them. Meaning, I don't think opening opposition are able to have a huge number of their benefits actually happen. I also think that the question that I think is still important in this debate is why are Western companies always going to do this incredibly ethically? We get some stuff from American government about the ways in which you are more held to account because there are laws within the West. The issue with this is that I think that companies just don't always follow the law. I think there are significantly more things that pressure these companies into access to do these in particularly good ways. Firstly, within a globalized world, I think the way in which you're able to now view the people who work in these countries and work in these mines in the first place is significantly more proximate to you. You see these people going into the mines, you understand what the issues actually look like because these things are posted on things like social media. Within the West, there is a huge push for ethical consumption because people view that you should, I think it's the kind of niche, the work we can do right now is to consume ethically, and I think that this just increases a huge amount of the pressure for companies to act in this way, especially when that is the thing that actually controls them, because they're able to lobby governments and get out of doing the laws, but they're not really able to lobby the people that are buying products from them in the first place, and they want to be able to appeal to those people more than they actually care about following things that the government tells them to do. What is the comparative? Why is it incredibly harmful? I think this is the comparative is that China just come in and do this. I think they do it for a few reasons. Firstly, because lithium is something that's incredibly important to them, they need a huge amount of it, and they also just need to extract it somehow. They already do this to a relatively large extent. Anyway, yeah.
I don't think you're fairly representing alternatives. Alternatives are sell raw lithium, sell refined lithium, sell specific battery parts made of nickel, sell batteries. You don't just need to make electric vehicles.
But refining lithium isn't that easy. So the thing with lithium, this is actually quite important. The important fact about lithium is it's incredibly toxic and very difficult to work with. All of these things mean that you probably don't want to engage in the first place. The reason, and this also changes that, the reason that politicians will always side with China if that is what they perceive to be the only option. Firstly, China offers very long-term loans. I think the benefits that China offer countries seem very attractive in the first instance because it's like, you don't have to pay that much back on this loan, which is a huge amount of money. But they will also do things such as offer to build the infrastructure that you need in order to mine lithium in the first place. I want to note that a lot of the countries that we talk about have huge issues with things like corruption, which means that they're building large infrastructure projects that are to extract things that are incredibly toxic from very mountainous places that are quite hard to get to, don't tend to exist near where roads exist already. It's incredibly difficult, and therefore it's quite a large infrastructure project. I think what this means is that firstly, countries are always going to have to choose China for that reason, because of the loans and the infrastructure, but also because there's a relatively low perceived risk, because you believe that China will give you the money for the lithium, and then they go and extract it themselves. The issue with building infrastructure degree to which you access that lithium is relatively uncertain, because you're not really sure if you go to these mountains and you mine lithium, you don't really know whether or not it's actually going to be there. I think it's also very difficult to understand quite how much of that will take, but also you don't know how the market's going to function in a few years. You don't realise that maybe if you build up all of this infrastructure, you may not have a market that exists in the same way in a few years. So you want to you want to decide with certainty, and you want to be able to ensure that you have the access to the money in comparison and you ever will be able to. I think the important thing here is that for Europe to be able to offer an alternative, they need to believe that there is their ability to do so. They need to believe that these countries are actually going to accept them into that country in the first place. I think when Europe offers the alternative, it just means that either China has to change the ways in which they're acting within these countries, because they now need to become more ethical in order for people to accept these deals in the first place. But also, I think it means that Europe have a high incentive to offer good deals, because they really do need this market in order to be able to develop electric vehicles in the way that they want to. This is incredibly important because panels, we're verging the verge of collapse, everything's going to shit, global warming is shit. But what this means is that these countries specifically also need access to things like electric vehicles. If you don't allow Europe into these countries, Europe don't have the capacity to engage in the green industry to the same degree. What this means is that China has complete control over that industry in the first place, meaning they also have control over the things such as how much electric cars are going to cost, also how much all of the batteries that you need in order to be able to do green energy are going to cost into the long term. All of these things mean that China will always be able to outcompete people, and you will never actually have them at a cost that these countries can actually afford, or they will be able to afford them when it is already too late, when the planet is already dying even more than it is. It's incredibly important that we create competition now. The last thing to note though is that obviously domestic industry still exists. I think they're able to use the Western industry that is put in place in these places, but secondarily, I think you're able to use it as a market competition. You're able to look at these things and be like, in the status quo, politicians don't really have any incentive to actually do the extraction well. I think on the comparative, when you have the West coming in and doing it well, you also have the comparative of they've been able to extract this much lithium. Now we have to extract this much lithium too. Otherwise, I think on their side of the day, you just go in, do what the fuck you want, and no one really can hold you to account.
Okay, we thank the speaker very much for their speech, and we now welcome the member of opposition to begin the closing of the case.
The snake might have really big eyes and make really nice promises. That doesn't mean it's not going to bite. We're going to make two very simple claims. Firstly, why are the mechanisms of Western deals exploitative in and of themselves, proving definitively why even if there's benefits on Gov's side from there being extraction, they do not offset the actual harms that will happen on the ground. Secondly, we'll tell you why a refining sector is possible and how it saves these economies. Let's start with talking about Western deals. And let's start by talking about who these countries are, right? They tend to be semi-autocratic, somewhat hybrid regimes, right? But often they need to do things like appeasing powerful cronies or things like the military in order to hold networks of power. That is, you as the existing government risk losing power if you don't keep the economy going well, because then they will withdraw that support and then give it to an opposition instead. And so that means that there's definitely risks there on the ground for you and you to keep them in power. But secondly, if you look factually, you'll notice that a lot of these economies have struggled recently. Argentina is drowning in massive amounts of debt and has gone on an austerity program that is massively unstable. Mexico has been struggling with its exports ever since China tried to do manufacturing again, making Mexican exports uncompetitive. So these countries are broadly, deeply struggling, and they need this money and investment in a crucial manner. So, why are these deals likely to be exploited by their nature? Firstly, the upfront cost. Opening government says that you might have part of the profit at a discounted price, but why would they give that to you, right? Like, how do these deals work? Mining is high fixed costs that a Western firm is paying when they enter. They're bringing expensive equipment, expertise. They need to clear and buy all this land for the high prices that opening government themselves prop. That cost is only justified by control of the entirety of the mine itself. So otherwise, you would never offer such a deal, because you would then not be able to recoup the high cost that you're putting in. You're never going to be able to justify that cost, and you might as well just go somewhere else. So even if there's an incentive to want to be nice to these countries, you lack the capacity, because otherwise you won't be able to clear the bottom line of how much money it costs you to try and get into the door in the first place. Opening government government tries to preempt this by saying that you have leverage. But this isn't a collective negotiation, right? You can play countries off against each other. The West is going to say, oh, we'll get one lithium mine in, should we make it in Argentina or in Serbia? You incentivize a race to the bottom between the deals offered by different countries, because as I framed to you, they desperately need the money. Secondly, there's easy money for any government from the start of the process. These are short-term struggling governments who really, really need this money right now. You offer them an upfront cost, like you offer them like an upfront fee at the start of it to say, you take this money right now, and we take control of the mine, and we can continue to have the license fees off of it. And that's easy money for these governments. Opening government tries to respond to this by saying that voters hate environmental damage. But do you know what brings everybody out to protest? High food prices. Deeper costs. So taking this easy money isn't the incentive of even the nicest, most charitable, most like democratic governments. Third, capital capacity. It's easier to get loans as a big company who's well established within these sectors because investors already trust you because you've done this before. You're well synergized and stuff like that. You've made this process very cheap. Versus if you're a new starting domestic firm, you'll probably get lower interest. You'll probably get higher interest rates and stuff like that because there's a higher risk associated with trying to enter with you. So it's easier to opt in, even if you would have benefited from you starting up the sector yourself, because you fear that you're going to fail, and so you don't take that risk on because there's higher capital costs. But last, it's always a risk for you to enter these sectors, versus the license fee that you get is stable money. You don't want to be the government who takes the risk on a sector like this and fails at a crucial time for your economy, versus experience, regulatory compliance of a big company who is well established is lower risk and a certain return. Is it the best good for the nation? No, but the state will take it because it benefits their immediate, selfish, short-term interests. So why are these contracts in short-termist and exploitative? Firstly, long-term deals mean that you're locked in a way. These governments, or Western companies, care about you being locked in with them because the companies that they have refinement contracts with also care about it being long-term. Let's say John Deere enters a country like the DRC and sets up a deal with them. The issue is, yeah, I know they do lithium extraction as well. I read about this recently. The issue is that they're getting a refining contract for their refined lithium with Ford. They need to make sure that Ford is locked in for the long run with them. So they're going to set up a long-term deal with like DRC, for example, that's very difficult for you to get out of because their profits are contingent on that. Secondly, they often have mandatory arbitration agreements, like using ISDS, for example. And these institutions tend to heavily align with the West because they're Western-led and funded institutions, and they always seem to rule in their favor. Why? Because they don't want to scare off investment in the developing world. You don't want to think that all of a sudden there's going to be a risk of money flying out of these developing countries because there's political risk associated with it. So you promise them these things, which means that you can't have accountability. You hold them to these standards, and they're enforced by the West. But lastly, there's regulatory monopolization. They have money versus a weak government that is poor, that can lobby extensively to change regulations in their favor. CG tried to respond by saying the West is ethical, woke consumers. Please tell me how many people at the supermarket care about that as opposed to come on. What is the impact here? The issue is that even if these countries are going to be super, super nice to you, I just don't know why it would be able to be done in such a way that the deal itself would be ethical. But why won't the West fix itself and give you every benefit OG wants, which is just as good as local governments without risk? That's the problem with opening opposition, right? They never tell you what the actual marginal difference is between a really nice deal from a company versus doing it yourself. We fill that gap and address this massive concern. We see the West as a massive problem. And stop this at just saying you get less money. But that is not the only harm. A much more intense harm is you losing out on the opportunity cost of all of this money that you could have made into the future because you were then bound by Western exploitation. Go ahead.
Your mechanism is that governments need this money because we are poor. Okay, but you don't engage with our mechanisms, which means that population will protest. They will banish.
But I don't know why the environment is the tipping point for them protesting, especially when most voters care a lot more about the food that is going to be feeding them. Let's talk about a refining sector. What is a refining sector? You extract the ore, but what you need is to refine it, turn it from a stone into the physical resource, like pure lithium, which Alex is right, is somewhat volatile. Why is it possible? Firstly, we can do things like collateralized loans, which is literally the lowest burden possible, because you incentivize someone else to put money in for their risk because they know they get something back. But secondly, there's an incentive to be money into the refining sector from companies to have a stake in it, because companies like Ford, for example, can reduce their upfront costs and dial in the manufacturing and refining to their specific needs, like lithium packaged for car batteries and made efficiently in that way, because that gives them a comparative advantage. Also, this is low land costs, low regulatory compliance costs, and that's the kind of thing. So then they'd be willing to take a risk with refining specifically. Why is this low burden? Yes, these companies face a risk, but their alternative is higher risk for them. They have lots of money to satisfy from selling lots of cars, but they don't have the lithium because there's no supply. So even if they fear losing the money in the developing world, it's worth it for them to reduce the high cost of Western refineries. Or rely on things like World Bank loans, which are not enough to extract on scale, or private investors who see places as Argentina as risky piece of melee, or Mexico as risky as domestic instability. So the lower burden certainty we've just proven to you significantly matters. Why is this better? Firstly, higher profits. The biggest profits in the refinement process. No one benefits from cocoa beans instead of chocolate that can be turned into chocolate bars. This is the thing that you want to buy. This means you can get direct deals with these kinds of companies. And why is this unique to our side? It's because the West wants their own refineries to be benefiting, and so they will directly give it to them, but the West won't want to lose their leverage over you as well. You can't do shit with the ore. You want to hold the power and keep it within your country. It is only on our side that the majority of profits can accumulate. It is only on our side that the people can be fed, and that should be enough to win the debate.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech. We now welcome the government whip to close off the government bench.
Access issues, things and sensory things. If you want to offer gear-wise, please not offer free-wise, please not stand up, simply raise your hand and I'll get to you eventually. I want to be crystal clear in this debate panel. No team has actually explained to you why the comparative is domestic investment. We've provided you the realistic comparative, which is that if you don't take the West's deal, these countries will be forced to take China's deal. The reason for this is that both groups have huge amounts of capital, which they can convince local political leaders to take that deal over anything else. Op bench may be correct, that it may be the correct profitable thing to develop your domestic industries. But but in terms of the incentives of local politicians, they look more short-termist because they have things like election cycles. These politicians would always be in power for the rest of the time. They want this money now so they can put across the political victories associated with that money. i.e. being able to build that infrastructure project you always wanted to do that your voters were crying out for. I think this is why, on either side of the debate, a deal is going to be done with someone. We say that the comparative is if you do the deal with the West and have that competition, then that brings better results for the people that live within these countries, and they also gain the benefits of helping everyone else around the world. I think that means that we are the most exclusive team explaining why that comparative exists and why that comparative is likely to be harmful. Why is that comparative likely to be harmful? I think China is a bad actor for a few main reasons. One is the precedent, i.e. they've done these projects before as a consequence of things like the BRI, etc. i.e. they've invested in underdeveloped countries, extracted a lot of resources and given them debts that they are unable to pay off later on the line. This has damaged these countries irrevocably, economically, in terms of them being unable to specifically pay back those loans, but also they also have the weight weighing over their head that the things that they've built, the bridges, etc., China can necessarily take back control of those things at any point. I also think that they have a worse economic incentive than the West. Because notably, China is already winning the battle in terms of the EV market, i.e. they are able to produce things at way lower cost because they don't have to have as much concerns about production costs as opposed to in the West. Which means then, I think frankly, the incentive upon which China is the only person at the table to provide the correct working conditions upon which the companies that are going into those countries in the first place and the concessions they talk about are genuinely horrible. i.e. they pay workers worse, they put them in worse conditions, use equipment that is genuinely unsafe and hurts people in the process. I think on the comparative, And Wadji responds to this, to be fair. They say, well, people aren't woke in the West. I think they're more woke than they are in China, right, guys? I think the reasons as to why this is likely to be true is because these people are a lot more politically accountable. You have a huge vocal minority of green activists who are able to galvanize, globalize support on things like social media and transpose those things and make it more politically proximate for those people in the West. I think this means in the vast majority of instances then, the West has at least some more of an incentive to do these things more ethically at the point at which it stands the chance to benefit those politicians that exist in the West when it's unclear how that's likely to do the same within China. I think this means then, for the debate, that we're able to explain to you why the ethical practices, both in terms of the amount of benefit that these countries can get, but also the conditions that exist within the workers, i.e. within the workplace, things that our opening find incredibly important in terms of opening opposition find incredibly important in terms of working conditions and local pollution, etc. The companies have the direct incentive to do this. This means they're unlikely to do all the lobbying that opening opposition talk about, because they have more of an incentive to do these things ethically than the local domestic companies ever would have done. I think this means that we're probably able to outweigh them in terms of the harms on this comparative. We're going to be able to specifically explain why this comparative is, what the individual actors behind the investment in the first place have the incentive to do this thing ethically. Cool. Going into weighing specifically against our opening there, our opening has two main contributions. One is that they say these things are likely to be done well. They give two reasons for this. One is the internal pressure that people care about pollution. Second one is outside actors. But notably, they're susceptible to all the pushes that bench push in terms of things like lobbying, etc. That these large companies have a huge amount of power to necessarily knock down the local people's concerns. I think, given the analysis I've already explained as to why politicians are relatively short-termist, I think they don't care about necessarily the things that the opening care about in comparison to just getting the projects that are passed in the first place. We are not susceptible to the lobbying argument because we say that the actors behind the lobbying aren't doing the pernicious actions that opening opposition want to talk about, which means that we are able to explain why these things are likely to be done well in a certain way at the point at which we show why the actors behind that are likely to do it. The second thing, on the concessions, they say two things on this. They say, one is that you're likely to get leverage over the EU at the point at which they're contingent on getting these resources in the first place. The second one is that you're getting the rewards of these profits. But genuinely, I'm unclear, A, as to why these things are useful for people, i.e. infrastructure. Why does that benefit everyone in that society that exists around these projects in the first place? But secondarily, you can have this on opposition side, right? Like, if they have gained access to the benefits of the resources, then the benefits that you, as an individual country, are likely to get is symmetric. We specifically explain to you in Backpath as to why the actors who are the most vulnerable in this debate, the people extracting those resources, who have to go down the mine every day and face the worst of those conditions, are put in positions where they are unlikely to be harmed to the same amount of extent. These people are more vulnerable than the generalised actors that opening government want to talk about. These people face suffering every single day, and thus they should be prioritised in that debate. But secondarily, we beat them on their own metric as well. We're going to explain to you that regardless of the incentives of the... before I continue, okay, opening.
China's local municipalities bankrupt, real estate collapse, and awful PR as a nation that uses bed traps. If it was true that China had the capacity to build lithium mines in foreign countries, they wouldn't currently be buying it from Australia.
Just because a country is doing bad economically doesn't mean they don't have excess capital. The US had an economic crisis in 2008, they still did investment. I think this is a ridiculous claim. They clearly are a huge country with a huge amount of capital. I don't think this means that investment doesn't happen. Maybe it's just a slight little bit less than they would have done during their prime. It still happens. Cool. I think then secondarily, I think we also outlay our opening on the things that they specifically want to talk about in terms of the long-term benefits. Because notably, in the 20 to 30 years, the climate crisis is going to become incredibly more proximate to the people that live within these countries, i.e. producer countries who don't have the necessary resources to protect themselves against the worst effects of climate change. These people need access to the green technology that's being produced within Western countries. And as such, we're able to provide that benefit specifically by showing how that investment is done in a way in which is ethical. I mean, you get like a good deal from the United States and Western countries, mean that they can gain access to these things cheaply and good. Which means that I think we're able to protect this the generalised actor to a significant degree as well. As such, in the debate. Thanks.
close off today's debate.
First, I'm going to deal with the comparative, dealing with the claim about China imposing government. Second, I'm going to talk about why the Western deals are incredibly bad and why opening government doesn't get any of the benefits they describe. Let's talk about the comparative first. We obviously agree with opening opposition, that is that the local extraction capacity is the comparative. Now, opening government might be obviously correct that the West would be more efficient in a vacuum. But if you believe the second claim that we are making, which is that very little comes out of that capacity, it's enough for us to prove that at least you have sufficient capacity to be able to make enough profit yourself. Now, top half and closing government have the back and forth when they are like, is it or is it not expensive? You need to train the workers. Is it up in the mountains? Is it really, really pricey? Is it actually quite cheap? We avoid that clash by explaining why it's possible to get the upfront capital without having Western companies specifically coming themselves. No matter how much money it costs, we explain that we can get it upfront. We explained that the alternatives are things like collateralized loans that are incredibly low risk, or foreign stakes in domestic companies that do not give the harms from the full control, but are providing you the upfront capital. And we explained that mining, uniquely, is one of the things that have very easy, quick return once you set it up, meaning that it's incredibly low risk, so the access to those loans is highly likely. There is stronger reason in opening opposition to improve the comparative that is independent of whether you believe mining is cheap or expensive. Here I want to deal with the closing government comparative about China. One, if we explain that you have the domestic capacity, so you are not dependent on China as they are claiming. But I also want to point out that China is unlikely to be the alternative for broadly three reasons. The first one is that China already has lots of their needs met. For instance, China already controls like 80% of DRC mines. It's unclear why they would need to be expanding more. But secondly, there are also capital constraints. That is, you have things like the avant-garde crisis, tariffs, the fact that China, because of those reasons, doesn't have the capacity to be bidding very highly for a mine. But thirdly, I will just point out that China doesn't want to be buying more, right? Currently, Chinese electric vehicles, for instance, are tariffed in the West. Because of that, China is unsure for future buyers, so they do not want to be consolidating lithium right now because it doesn't make sense for them. So lastly, I would just also point out that like the only comparative that they have is like Chinese people are less like concerned than the Western people. I will deal with that later, but I think we explained that all the harms that they are describing about China are also just symmetric on our side, and we prove that there is a comparative of being able to do domestic extraction. Let's talk about the harms and why the Western deals are bad. The bottom line of this claim is that these deals are exploitative. These countries will be stuck in really poor deals long term that will be economically harmful in the long run. I want to be clear about why it's relevant for weighing against opening opposition and opening government. Opening government says that these countries will have leverage and will negotiate good deals. They have a couple of reasons for that. I want to point out that the all responses are not really dealing with the core of the claim of opening government. Because they say things like the companies have money and lobbying power. But if it's true from OG that these countries have leverage and they are able to negotiate deals, it's unclear why throwing money at them, as all says, is going to be the thing that's going to persuade them to go against their populations. They say they want to maximize profit, but again, OG's claim is that of capacity. The government say no, but then they don't let them maximize profit in the pernicious ways. Similarly, like campaign donations, they never explain why it's something that outweighs the things that OG points out. This is when our analysis comes in. So if we prove that this leverage does not exist and the deals are bad, we beat opening government by minimizing all of their benefits and already proving the comparative and why it's plausible. But we also extend an opening opposition by actually properly mechanizing all their harms, or economic harms and environmental harms that they are pointing out. What then are the things that opening government says and closing government says to an extent about why those deals will be done well? The first reason is that people care about the environment. The first thing I would point out, and the extent of the analysis, like there are protests in Serbia. That's actually it. Like look at your notes. They don't really explain why this is something that people care about so much, especially compared to other issues. The first thing we pointed out is that only applies in democracies, but I'm going to deal even with that best case scenario for them. Because here is the issue that we point out. The environment is hardly ever an electorally determinative issue for people. They perhaps care about it in abstract, but it's not the thing that they will vote on the basis of, because there are always much more proximate things. For instance, like your healthcare, like your taxes, like how the inflation is doing, and things like that, that are affecting them on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to what's happening in some kind of mine, kilometers away from where they are living. Because of that, the mining contracts will not be something that people will be caring about enough so that they would change their votes. So political parties do not have the incentive to be pondering on people's opinions on that basis, because people will be voting on other issues. Opening government never explain why this is the thing that people care about more than anything else. Given that governments don't have to be responsive to the will of the people in that regard, they are far more likely to be acting on their more proximate short-term incentive, which is what Bashi described as the upfront fee that the Western company can offer alongside a really, really rubbish contract. That is that if you are a government who is short-termist, who has a short-term electoral incentive staying in power for like 4 years, if you do not have the huge voting pressure, then it's obviously you opt in for the short-term financial gain and accept a contract that is really bad. And that is independent of any of the outright corruption opening opposition asserts. That just explains why they're likely to take a long-term terrible deal if it gives them easy thing upfront at the beginning. OG.
Even if you create your own company, which you could test, Western companies are much more bigger. Two, do not have fixed costs.
Yes.
It's much faster.
It's going to be really good. The Western companies are going to be really efficient at it, but all the money is going to go to the West. So like the countries, this is in the interest of the countries. It's not about what's best for mining, right? So secondly, they say that companies will be dependent on those countries because they have no other option. The problem that we point out that they miss is that they should presume that these countries are negotiating collectively, but obviously they are not negotiating collectively. So that you have a race to the bottom, right? Because they can go from Mexico to Serbia if Serbia is like, okay, Mexico is not accepting the rubbish deal, so that deals with that. CG has the stuff about ethical consumption and social media. At best, that would apply on worker standards, not at the contents of the deals. Like the deals are not flashy and making people sad, and no one's reading it and seeing how much is Mexico getting screwed over in a deal. But even otherwise, like we are desensitized on poor worker standards. Even if people are upset, again, it's not the electorally determinative issue that's going to make governments change regulations and pressure these companies. What then these contracts look like? We explained they have long-term locked into very, very poor terms, very little fees. On our side, you get full profit. We pointed out mandatory arbitration clauses, which is the mechanism why you don't have environmental standards, because you can't change regulations because you get sued in Western arbitration courts. We pointed out that you have the ability on our side to sell who you want to sell to, which allows you, for example, to incentivize refinery investments into your country. For all those reasons, I'm so proud of those.
Okay, thank you very much for the speech and everyone for an excellent debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands and make your way outside, and we'll be back in the oral education shortly.
So I'll just stop the recording.
So you